Good evening, everybody. Tonight's session, the Second American Revolution, the Civil War and the struggle over slavery, 1850 to 1875, is, I think, going to be one of the highlights of the series. Given the recent events in the United States, the presidential election, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the continuing debates over questions of race and class, and indeed the American Constitution. I heard, for example, a state legislator from Mississippi talk about a new confederacy last week. The issues that we're going to look at today, I think, are really directly relevant. The reason why I think it's relevant for socialists throughout the world to understand the American Civil War is, of course, that Marx and Engels, and indeed the international working class movement in the 1860s, followed events very closely in the United States. Many of Marx's old comrades were soldiers in the Union Army, and progressive and socialist and working class people throughout the world followed that war very closely, and indeed gave all sorts of material support to the victory over the Confederacy. But I'll leave that to one side now and introduce Dan Lazare, who's going to talk about the Second American Revolution. We'll have the usual format, with Dan, which is that after he's given the introduction, we'll have a series of questions and discussion points, and I'll take those individually. Okay, so good evening, Dan, and we're all looking forward to this.
Thank you. So, it's a very big topic, of course. The Civil War itself was a huge military operation. America had a population of 31 million people at the time. It was, by that point, emerging into the top ranks of industrial powers. So the war was the most modern war that had been fought to date in the industrialized world. So the conflict was very important. It involved the movement of vast numbers of soldiers and weaponry across huge spaces, the use of railroad, artillery, etc. So it was a militarily very important event, as well as a politically very important event, because of course it eradicated what was at the time the economically most powerful slave economy in the world. So that's why it was that's why Marx and Engels followed it so closely. And Marx and also Engels as well wrote, I think, dozens of articles on the war for for the New York Tribune, for one thing, and also for a newspaper, the Die Presse, I believe it's called, in Vienna. So they followed the war very closely. They wrote about it, they analyzed it, and they thoroughly agreed as to its world-shaking importance. But this talk refers to the Civil War as the Second American Revolution. And before we get into the war itself, I want to explore what that concept means. For example, why did America need a second revolution? How many revolutions does a country get to have? And if the second revolution was necessary to abolish slavery, what was the first revolution all about? And I'd like to approach this problem via the French Revolution, because the French Revolution was the first modern revolution in that it, number one, virtually invented the concept of modernity, number one. And number two, first developed the concept of a revolution as a great forward motion, in contrast to previous concepts of revolution, which saw them as basically backward looking, an attempt to return to some kind of long lost golden age, to recover ancient liberties that had been lost due to encroaching tyranny. The French Revolution shattered this concept and essentially invented the idea of modern revolution, as I said. But there were actually three revolutions in one in France. The first one was actually an aristocratic revolution, which began in May 1788, when the aristocracy rose up against Louis XVI's attempts to impose uniformity and order on the kingdom, and eventually forced him to call a estates general, états généraux, essentially a meeting of the three estates of the kingdom, which had last been held in 1614, but under pressure from the aristocracy, was ordered by Louis to take place in Versailles in May 1789. The Aristocratic Revolution was anti-royalist. It drew support from the bourgeoisie, the commoners in the cities, and the peasantry. And essentially, it was a restorationist revolution attempting to roll back royal absolutism and to establish the balanced constitution that has supposedly existed in past years. Balance, that is, between the three estates, in which the privileges of each of the three estates, king, aristocrats, clergy, and commoners, that's four actually, but were needed to balance off one another in order to preserve liberty and order. The Second French Revolution broke out in May 1789, when the commoners, the Third Estate, demanded the other two estates cease meeting separately and meet under a common banner of the Third Estate to form a national assembly. That revolution quickly took an anti-aristocratic turn, but curiously enough, it was pro-royalist in the sense that it envisioned the king continuing as a kind of a Washington-style father of his country and exercising a limited veto over legislation. And that second revolution ended in 1791 to 1792, when the king and queen attempted to flee to Austrian lines in Germany and were halted in the eastern French town of Varennes, taken prisoner and returned to Paris. And when a German Duke of Brunswick issued a famous proclamation in July 1792, essentially threatening vengeance on the people of Paris if a single hair was harmed on the head of a Louis or Marie Antoinette. And that led to a huge upsurge, a huge radicalization of the revolution. And essentially, the revolution entered its third stage, which was both anti-aristocratic and anti-royalist. And that, of course, was the radical democratic stage, in which the idea of revolution as forward progress essentially was realized. And the country hurtled forward, mobilizing the masses, the levée en masse, the mass draft, reforming the weights and measurements, creating a new calendar, declaring all citizens to be equal, et cetera, et cetera. So ancient liberties were forgotten, and new liberties, new democratic rights, new democratic obligations were created as part of this great leap forward. And in Europe in the 1780s, the great choices were between, the choices were seen as limited between essentially royal progress and rationalism and old democratic liberties, which implied a very static view of society. And as I said before, the French Revolution shattered this old model beginning in 1791-92 and created the idea of a strong democratic forward thrust that the revolution would help create and unleash. So let's go to America. Now, the American Revolution broke out in the 1770s. It preceded the French Revolution by a dozen or more years. So if the French Revolution was the first modern revolution, the American Revolution was the last pre-modern revolution. In that sense, is it essentially adhered to the old pre-1789 view of revolution as basically restorationist, as restoring old liberties, resisting royal tyranny, casting off restraints so that society could resume its natural course. And in America, this did not seem illogical because America, especially the North, was the most democratic society on earth at the time. There was no aristocracy in the North, that is. There were not great gaps between rich and poor. Most people were farmers. A growing number worked in the cities as artisans and laborers. And traditionally, liberty was seen as residing in local institutions, in the town hall, the town meeting, the town store, the local farmhouse. These were seen as the sources of liberty, and central control, which was identified with the king and parliament in London, were seen as the sources of tyranny. So in some ways, the typology was exactly the opposite of what it was in France and in Europe generally. So everything was kind of upside down in this last pre-modern revolution. The revolution began in 1774 when the Continental Congress met for the first time, an all-American Congress. And essentially it represented an alliance of the northern bourgeoisie and the southern slaveholding squirearchy or neo-nobility against Parliament, but in favor of the crown, actually, because they looked to George III for relief from parliamentary pressures. One historian says that Americans at that point were more Tory than George III himself. Then in 1775 to 76, with the start of the war, the revolution entered a second stage in which there was an alliance between the bourgeoisie and the southern squirearchy against both the crown and Parliament. So that corresponds, well, to a very early stage in the French Revolution. And this bourgeois squirearchy alliance was solidified with the promulgation of a new with the promulgation and adoption of a new constitution in 1787 to 1788. That locked the old alliance in place. And then it was frozen for roughly, I guess it's 70 years. It's as if the French Revolution had been suddenly suspended in, say, I don't know, June 1789, leaving everything, all the institutions in place, except for the crown, of course, rearranging relations between them, but otherwise all, locking the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie in a very similar relationship, which was essentially unbreakable. So America, in certain respects, entered a great deep freeze. Now, the deep freeze was highly paradoxical because politics were immobilized, and they were especially frozen from 1820 on, when something called the Missouri Compromise was reached, essentially locking the two sides in place. But the economy was simultaneously unleashed. And America saw the greatest period of capitalist development really in the history since the English Revolution of the late 18th century. Um, Some of the important features were a dual rush to the west as settlers from New England and the mid-Atlantic states flowed into the Ohio Valley, into the northern Midwest of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa, and then out to California by 1848. That's, they, in a space of half a century, essentially America expanded 3,000 miles across the country. Simultaneously, with the invention of the cotton gin, a machine for cleansing cotton of its sticky black seeds, which ironically was invented by a Connecticut Yankee named Eli Whitney, the cotton production exploded and slavery expanded dramatically to the west as well, reaching as far west as eastern Texas, and also into the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida in the south. So that the two expanded simultaneously to the west. And simultaneously, beginning with the American Revolution, northern states where slavery, by the way, had been legal, although it was not very widespread, began abolishing slavery in the 1780s. So slavery was increasingly sectoralized. And turned into a north-south affair. So we saw the dramatic expansion of the Southern slave economy, and at this point, this is when the South was very closely integrated into the British industry, especially in Manchester, most famously. So the dramatic expansion of cotton production, and beginning in the 1820s, an even more dramatic industrial expansion in the North. Between 1817 and 1837, for example, cotton production and northern textile mills increased 75 times. The Erie Canal, which was dug in 1825, linked New York City with the Great Lakes in the Upper West Side, and the Upper Midwest. I'm sorry, and Chicago went from being a tiny village to a burgeoning city by the 1840s, growing by leaps and bounds. By 1850, the US had 3,500 miles of canals, nearly all, by the way, in the north. By 1860, the US rail network was bigger than the rest of the world's combined. By 1861, telegraph spanned the continent. And beginning in the 1840s, British manufacturers were sending delegations to the United States to view the, quote, American system of manufacturing using machine-made interchangeable parts at first hand. In fact, in the 1850s, Samuel Colt, who made the famous Colt revolver, set up a factory outside of London. It was an example, one of the first examples of US technology invading Europe. So the northern United States was the most advanced industrial society on Earth by the 1840s and 50s. In the Northeast, children were going to school by age 14 or 15, all children, by the way. In the Northeast, more than 95% of adults were literate. But by the same token, the South lagged farther and farther behind. Literacy was only at 80%, and of course, few slaves could read or write at all. But even counting slaves, the US population of a whole was 80% literate, which put them ahead of Britain, which was only 2/3 literate, and other Northern European economies. And Southern and Eastern Europe were only about 1/4 of the population was literate. So the US, to repeat, was the most advanced industrial society at the time, the US North, I should say, and also the most advanced democracy at the time. It was the only after with the accession of Napoleon III in France. In fact, it was the only people's democracy left on Earth. But however, thanks to the Constitution and thanks to this alliance between the bourgeoisie and the Southern aristocracy that had been locked into place, the South was able to extend its control over the country as a whole, increasingly. It used, there were four main mechanisms which it was able to use in order to capture control of the federal government in Washington. These included the famous 3/5 clause, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional apportionment. In other words, the South gained congressional seats in Washington by virtue of the slaves it owned. And this essentially gave the South 25 extra seats by 1860 in the House of Representatives, the lower house, and 25 extra votes in the Electoral College. And as a result, all US presidents from 1800 to I think 1852 were slaveholders. Another mechanism which gave the South a huge advantage was the question of equal state representation in the US Senate, the upper house, which since the South had parity in in terms of the number of states, gave the South veto power over judicial appointments, cabinet appointments, treaties, etc. So that meant that the judiciary was essentially, the federal judiciary was essentially Southern controlled as well. The Constitution contained a fugitive slave clause requiring free states to return runaway slaves, a provision that was strengthened in 1848, which essentially by federal legislation that gave the South the right to send bounty hunters into the North and essentially yank any Black person off the streets they wanted and return them, or actually enslave them, since many of them were not in fact, were simply free citizens, were not in fact runaway slaves, and return them to the South with absolutely no judicial oversight. This led to riots in Boston, by the way, which was the center of abolitionism. And finally, the fourth constitutional mechanism that gave the South a huge advantage was a highly restrictive amending clause, which governed how the Constitution could be changed. And that amending clause allowed tiny minorities to veto any constitutional alteration, and therefore allowed the South to essentially halt in its tracks any attempt at the federal level by the northern states to somehow resolve the slavery question legally and peacefully. So by the 1840s, with the growth both of northern industrialism and southern slave production, what you had were two increasingly separate nations and increasingly hostile nations under one roof. With the growth of abolitionism from the 1820s on, the two sides were increasingly at war with one another. In fact, a war did break out in the Kansas territories west of the Mississippi River over whether those territories would be admitted to the Union as free states or slave states. And these were actually very bloody altercations where a man named John Brown essentially took a leading part in the military operations there in fighting against the growing influence of slaveholding elements. So just to repeat, the growing conflict, the growing rift between these two mutually opposed societies grew more and more unrestrainable by the late 1840s, early 1850s. And then, in fact, violence, even before the war, violence began to rage for a full decade in the 1850s in the Western Territories. And in 1858, a group of a leading group of Northern abolitionists actually funded a raid by John Brown on a federal arsenal in Northern Virginia, a town of Harper's Ferry. It was Brown's idea that he would seize the arsenal, spark a slave uprising, and use the guns that he seized to arm the slaves so they could fight for their freedom and establish a free free Black republic in the heart of the South. And the John Brown's expedition, of course, was a woeful failure, and there's a good deal of evidence that he knew it would be a failure, that he kind of saw it as a propaganda of the deed. And in fact, his uprising was suppressed, and he himself was captured by federal forces, by the way, led by a certain Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would become famous as a Southern general, and another officer named Jeb Stuart, who would also become equally famous as a Southern general. But Brown's expedition was really the first shot in the Civil War, because it quickly became apparent that he had enjoyed extensive Northern funding and support, and that he was finally hung after giving a dramatic speech in which he said, "Rivers of blood would have to flow before America was cleansed of its sins." But when he was finally hung, church bells rang throughout the North. There was a great mourning, and it was quite clear from that point on that warfare was inevitable. The war itself broke out in April 1861. Lincoln himself was elected in 1860. He captured overwhelming majorities in the northern states. He's one of four candidates who ran. He captured only 40% of the total vote, but those were overwhelming majorities in the North. And he wasn't even allowed to campaign in the South because Republicans would literally have been lynched. But his accession to the presidency, his election in November 1860, and his inauguration, which in those days took place in March of the following year, made it quite clear that separation, secession was an unstoppable process. And throughout the South, a series of state conventions voted to secede. The movement became unstoppable. It spread from Virginia to Texas. And secession became a fact as soon as Lincoln took office, and a month later, the process was completed when the South began hostilities by bombarding a federal federal fort in the southern port. So the war, as I said, involved the movement of vast numbers of men and materiel over huge areas. It was the greatest military operation in an advanced industrial economy to date. The whole world watched very closely what was going on, and Marx and Engels did too. And as everyone knows, the war went extremely poorly for the North in the roughly the first year and a half. from April 1861 to September 1862. And in fact, the war was going so badly for the North that in a fascinating exchange of letters, Engels wrote to Marx that he was so disgusted with the North's incompetent performance, its incompetent management of the war, that not only would it lose to the South, but it deserved to lose to the South. I mean, its incompetence was reprehensible, was so reprehensible. And Marx wrote back a great letter in which he disagreed. And he pointed out that the North was a very complex industrial commercial society, which had been content to leave military affairs in the hands of the South, which was a much simpler society in which white men were all armed because the threat of a Black revolt was ever present. And therefore, white society was heavily militarized and therefore enjoyed a huge military advantage initially. And Marx said, yes, this was happened. The North had no idea how to wage war. It had very few experienced military leaders. Its citizens were not used to carrying guns. They were used to working in factories and offices or plowing fields. In the South, the horses were ridden, and the North, horses were used as draft animals, either to pull plows or pull wagons and carriages. So Marx said that the North was very backward in this respect and would take a while before it caught up with the South in terms of the arts of war. But then he said something very prophetic. He said that once the North learned how to fight, it would become unstoppable. So once it married Northern industry and Northern democracy to the prosecution of the war, the result would be a war machine like no other. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. I think September 1862 saw the Battle of Antietam, which the North won. Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862. It went into effect the following January. Lincoln had been very reluctant to invoke the slave question. He initially defined the war in minimalist terms of just simply keeping the country together and preventing secession. He wanted to avoid the slavery question at all costs. But within 15 months, he had no choice but to free the slaves in the South and to declare slavery as the foremost target of the Union war effort. And then from roughly late 1862 onward, as Marx had foreseen, the Northern war machine gathered speed. The North was able to put far more men and far more material into the field. It had developed a brilliant leadership under people like Grant and Sherman. The North could take larger casualties and keep on coming. The North was able to draw from a great immigrant workforce, which signed up for the war, although there were, of course, political conflicts due to the famous bounty system that allowed the rich to buy their way out of the draft. But the North was able to use its great advantages, its great democratic industrial advantages, more and more, so that the South was sent reeling, and the war was essentially all but over by 1863. It took 2 more years or 1.5 more years of mopping up operations, but certainly the South was increasingly on the defensive from that point on. So the Civil War clearly corresponded to the 3rd stage of the French Revolution. the stage when in France, when starting in 1791-92, the bourgeoisie rose up against both the aristocracy and the crown, cast both overboard, and thus allowed this great forward motion to take place. And the same thing happened in the North when the northern bourgeoisie, by this point, heavily industrialized, turned against the southern squirearchy and just essentially pulverized it. The Jacobins declared slavery at an end, not only in France itself, but in all the colonies, in February 1794. The proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, as we've seen, occurred in September 1862, followed by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery throughout the Union in January 1865. So what France accomplished in 1794, the US accomplished, 71 years later in 1865. In France, the Jacobin centralized government, the process that started earlier, they abolished provinces, they replaced them with uniform, smaller départements, they abolished provincial privileges, etc. And essentially the same process occurred in the North. Lincoln broke Virginia, the most important state of the Confederacy, into two parts when he encouraged the secession within the secession of West Virginia, which is pro-Union, in late 1861. They of course declared war on states' rights in the South, and also greatly restricted state prerogatives in the North. For example, many states had wanted to form state battalions, but that was greatly restricted under Lincoln. And they also unleashed a great industrial program, as the Jacobins had as well, by centralizing finances, encouraging manufacturing, etc. Lincoln, once the South had withdrawn from the Union, and Congress was left solidly, it was really kind of a rump parliament, was left solidly in Union hands and Republican hands. The radical Republicans moved very quickly to establish a national banking system, to authorize the construction of a transcontinental railroad stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, to pass a land grant college system, which had been bottled up by Southern resistance for decades, allowing states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan to establish university systems that are now world famous. And they also authorized a system by which settlers could claim free land throughout the West, which led to a further westward movement and the establishment of Union power throughout the entire Western United States, the firming up of Union power. So these are all kinds of things, more or less kinds of things, the equivalent some 6 or 7 decades later from what the Jacobins had done in France. Which is why I think the Civil War does deserve the name of, deserves to be described as the Second American Revolution. But there's one thing I want to point out, which is very, very important, is the Jacobin Revolution, of course, is famous for its bloodiness. The guillotine, suppression of the Vendée uprising, which reached truly horrifying degrees. I mean, in one famous incident, political prisoners were tied and placed on a barge in the middle of the river. The barge was then intentionally sunk, drowning hundreds of political prisoners. So it was a very brutal, bloody affair. But one historian, William Doyle, in the Oxford History of the French Revolution, estimates that if you add up all the victims in the suppression of the Vendée uprising, and all the victims in the of the terror in the cities, Paris, but also in other cities as well, you probably come to a figure of 280,000 deaths in all throughout the French Revolution. That's a lot of people, obviously. That amounts to roughly one person in 100. The U.S., the Civil War claimed 620,000 deaths at a time when the U.S. population was 31 million. That is one person in 50. So the U.S. Civil War, the Second American Revolution, was twice as bloody, proportionally speaking, as the French Revolution. And you could argue that this unnatural prolongation of the two revolutions, the 70-year gap that existed between the first American Revolution and the Second American Revolution, led to caused it to be all the bloodier, all the more horrifying. So America, which likes to think of itself as a land of peace and civilization, and of course utterly horrified by any idea of bloody political radicalism, actually outdid the Jacobins by a ratio of 2 to 1. So I think that's about it. I didn't get to to Reconstruction, although I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have about that, and the failure of the Second American Revolution, which parallels in certain ways the failure of the French Revolution from Thermidor in 1794 on. But if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to return to that topic.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. That was very interesting, stimulating talk. I've got a couple of questions which have come in. Before I put them through, can I just remind people that if you want to ask questions, you can either use the participant button and click on there with your name. You'll get a little blue hand and I can see that. Or alternatively, you can ask in the chat column, just again ask to come in that way. So the first question then is from Tony Greenstein. If Tony can be brought in, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Tony.
Right, okay. I mean, I have a couple of questions. One of them was answered, which was about Andrew Jackson, because he was, I'm told, from Kentucky in the South. But given his record in terms of exterminating the native Indians and his, I mean, the admiration of Trump for him, the most famous, his favorite president. Why did Lincoln choose a character like that? Even assuming that he needed to have a running mate who was from the South, it would seem extremely strange. And my second question, which is entirely different, is when I did American history for my MA many years ago, or British colonial rule, I was always led to believe that up till about the First World War, it was Britain which was the leading industrial power in terms of coal line, steel production, etc. And what you're telling me, it was by the mid-19th century, the United States had overtaken Britain. I was just interested in where the truth lay. Okay.
Tony, first of all, you made an elementary mistake. Andrew Jackson was a president from 1833 to I think 18.
All right.
Andrew Johnson.
Sorry.
And Jackson was from Kentucky. Johnson was from the border state of Tennessee. He was a Democrat, and Lincoln took him on as vice president in order to, as a lure for free state Democrats in cause. He was, in some ways, he was quite ferociously anti-slaveholder, but he also was ferociously racist as well. The combination was fairly common in the border states. And so when Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, Johnson took over and began undoing much of the Reconstruction efforts, the post-war Reconstruction efforts that Republicans were trying to institute. And actually, Marx wrote to Engels and just expressing dismay over Johnson's conduct. And as for the question of the U.S. versus U.K. industrial power, I simply meant that the U.S. was forging ahead quite dramatically. Its industrial technique was moving into the lead worldwide by the 1850s. Its total output, I'm not sure. I really do believe that by the 1870s or 80s, the U.S. had achieved preeminence, and U.S. Steel was the first billion-dollar corporation, and that was in the 1890s. So I believe by that point the U.S. actually had achieved preeminence, but I'm actually not positive.
Okay, Dan, this is a question that came in on the text, and it's from Pauline Fraser. And
Kevin,
said,
she wants to come in herself anyway.
Oh, okay, bring her in. Sorry.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, here I'm sorry.
Can you switch on your camera, Pauline?
Yeah, no, I know. I'm looking for my camera at the moment. Hang on. Start video. Here we are. Here we are.
There you go.
And I seem to be up in a little corner. Oh, yeah, that's sort of fine. Okay. Yeah, my question basically, I did come in slightly late, so apologies if I got this slightly wrong. But what I thought you were saying, Dan, was that the northern industrialized, the industrial part of North America, which was sort of the northeast, it was basically built on cotton and manufacturing cotton products. And clearly those came from the South, which was the slave owning states. One would have thought that there was a common interest then between the northern industrialists who were manufacturing cotton goods and manufacturing, as you were saying, machine tools for cotton production, which made it much more efficient than what was going on in Britain at the time. That there would have been a common interest there, because I would have imagined that producing cotton under slavery was a more profitable exercise, and therefore the North could secure cotton supplies at a premium, a lower price than they would have done if it was free labor.
Yes, that is true. There were pro-Southern elements. There were extensive pro-Southern elements among the in the North and among the industrialists.
Right.
They did business with the South. They bought cotton. They shipped cotton to Britain, and they also provided the South with financial services, which were very important. And so all of these did create cross-sectional loyalties, which were perplexing and infuriating to the abolitionists. But those loyalties were torn apart in the 1840s and 50s over issues involving tariffs, for example, which the North favored and the South opposed, over federal funding for industrial infrastructure, which the South also opposed, and by popular agitation by Northern workers, laborers, and artisans who saw slavery as a system which would impoverish the working class, which is absolutely true, and whites were left destitute throughout the South, increasingly destitute. Their conditions were plunging lower, more and more. And so therefore the battle within the North was extremely hard fought as advocates of compromise and national unity, above all else, clashed with anti-slave elements. So you're right, that was very important. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky and then moved with his father. His father moved his family to Illinois. Which I don't know if you know where that is, but that's several hundred miles to the north. And his father was an example of an economic refugee, fleeing the increasingly harsh effect of slavery on white workers and farmers. and that's why they moved north to the free economy. They say, you know, the Ohio River separates the South from the North, and that, you know, west of the Appalachians. And on one side, the land was ragged and unkempt, and on the other side, it was, you know, a place of, like, you know, of neat picket fences, pristine New England style villages, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, so the northern workers and tradesmen and farmers, and of course northern women, to be a very important force that I did not get into, just sort of felt in their bones that their entire way of life was threatened by the slave system.
Thank you.
Okay, next question, Anne McShane.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, Anne. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you, Anne.
Okay, sorry. I'm in the car on the way home. Okay, so Daniel, what I wanted to ask you is related to the last question. I wanted to ask you about the impact of the revolution on the nature of the United States working class, and maybe a bit about like whether the working class participated as a class in the revolution, or whether they, you know, were just in the process of formation at that time, etc. So just on that issue, thank you.
Yeah, it had a revolutionary impact. In the 1850s, industry was growing rapidly, but was still predominantly small scale, a matter of individual shops. There were some attempts at labor unions, but in general, the North was dominated by what was called a free labor ideology. And that became sort of the essence of the Republican ideology as it developed over subsequent decades. And Lincoln was an advocate of this ideology. He said, you know, he started out as a poor man, a rail splitter, working for others. But as he made his way up in the world, other people would work for him. So that was the American dream as understood in the 1850s. You started off as a laborer with the hope of becoming a boss and moving up the scale. And social mobility, by the way, was very high in those decades. So it was not completely, you know, an unrealizable dream. But after the war, brought a vast industrial explosion. Before the war, the average American railroad, although even though the rail system was incredibly diverse, the average American railroad was only 100 miles long, and there were literally dozens of different rail gauges in operation. After the Civil War, that was all standardized, and railroads came under the domination of giant corporations. And of course, the financial sector boomed as well, as did heavy metals, coal, etc. And this gave rise to a massive classic proletariat, and the growth of mass strikes for the first time. And in fact, 1876, it was 1877, I'm sorry, was a watershed because it marked the end of Reconstruction, the formal abandonment of Reconstruction, and simultaneously the start of a nationwide rail strike, which was tumultuous. And so federal troops were withdrawn from the South and deployed through the North to suppress the strike. So in a space of a few decades, 2 or 3 decades, the U.S. went from a place of small scale shops and workplaces to a place of huge factories, you know, factory workforces numbered in the thousands, and of strikes breaking out on a national scale.
Okay, Matthew Jones, please.
Yeah. Okay. I think there's a few things. I mean, obviously, it's a very interesting. It's an extremely interesting period, and I think it's there's a few things that I think. I mean, one, I think as you're talking about previous just now about the whole nature of the growth of the working class and the conflict and the growth of strikes and so on. There's also, I think, that there's always been this attitude of the American ruling class that it's quite prepared and indeed organizes itself to employ quite enormous amounts of violence against the working class. Has no compunction about shooting people. Unlike, say, in Europe, where there's a bit less interest in deploying armed force and killing people by the numbers when they go on strike. In the US, they seem to have no particular issue with this, and the use of private armies like the Pinkertons and so on and so forth in order basically just to either strong arm or kill people to prevent them from organizing. I think the thing about the war itself is it is fought in a quite a almost an amateur way. I mean, I think the issue when you're talking about the North being unable to win is, of course, that actually the army in the US, of course, they weren't particularly militaristic, so they had a very small officer corps and very little experience. So they really didn't know how to deploy the forces they were using, and especially for the North. And actually Lee, I believe, was offered command of both sides, and chose to fight for the South. And this is the problem: is that it was the quality of the leadership, and of course Lincoln was driven to actually sacking his generals on a regular basis whenever they were proven to be useless, and eventually found Grant and others who could do the job. But it took a while to do it, and it took a bit of time to develop the experience. And this is one of the reasons why I think it was the rate of killing was so great, because basically they were blundering about and using rifles with the firing mini balls, which is probably one of the nastiest projectiles you can find, from very close ranges, and therefore people were getting torn up and killed at a rate. The other thing, of course, about the whole thing is the question of another perpetual thing in America is race, and the whole issue. The North was somewhat reluctant. I mean, was seriously reluctant to employ black soldiers. They didn't want to have them in the first place. They certainly didn't pay them the same as white soldiers. And eventually, they got to the used to the ideas that they needed to have black soldiers, because obviously black soldiers were very keen to fight. But this thing carries on, and at the same time, as you say, also the whole question of, say, moving towards the Homesteading Act and so on, which is basically then a program of extermination of the indigenous peoples, which goes alongside that. You see, obviously, the map, any map in the US, you can see where the line is where the Homestead Act applies, because everything's in squares. But first, to get there, of course, they had to drive out and exterminate most of the people who lived there. And of course, there is, actually, I believe that recently a statue of Lincoln has been brought down on the basis that he actually agreed to the killing of a number of Indians, in an uprising in I think it's Minnesota. So I mean, it'd be interesting to see what you had to say on.
Are we still there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Dan. Yes, go ahead.
That's all true. I mean, the North blundered about for a good year and a half. The military brass was dominated by Southerners. West Point, the famous U.S. War College, was Southern dominated as well. In fact, Robert E. Lee graduated first in his class, but his classmate was Ulysses S. Grant, who I believe graduated last in his class. And for radical Republicans in Congress, that was actually a point in Grant's favor, because it means that he had resisted all the Southern propaganda that was so rife at West Point. Lee was a dashing romantic figure. Grant was a short, gruff, sloppily dressed, cigar smoking, heavily drinking guy who was very unromantic, but it was very much the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads in terms of him and Lee. Of course, the question of race. I mean, this war is about nothing if not about race. And Lincoln was very reluctant to use Black troops. But as the war pressed on and the war took on more and more of a revolutionary character, it was inevitable that he would draw on Black troops, and Black troops would give the war its revolutionary edge and provide a very important margin of victory. Because remember, whites, the North was troubled continuously by white deserters, but Blacks were their most steadfast troops, because they're the ones who really had skin in the game, as we say. So they provided the North with its all-important margin of victory, which of course renders the post-war sellout all the more tragic. And as to the westward expansion of the Indians, you're right, of course. The westward expansion, while solidifying Union power west of the Mississippi, also spelt the end for the American Indians, the Native Americans. And that one incident involving the mass execution of Indians in Minnesota, it's important to point out that local authorities had wanted to kill 300 Indians who had taken part in an uprising in which many settlers, by the way, were killed. And Minnesota was seething with anger and resentment, and demanding that the Indians, a policy of maximum brutality to the Indians. And Lincoln and his cabinet went over the charges very carefully, and eventually winnowed them down to only 28 people who were executed. Now, of course, that still is profoundly upsetting to us today, but still, it shows how Lincoln was trying to get a handle on the problem and trying to create a policy, a more humane policy, rather than the outright extermination advocated by so many elements on the frontier.
Okay, Steve Freeman now. Next question.
There we go.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've unmuted myself. That's right. Okay. Yeah, that was very interesting, and thank you for that. A couple of things that occurred to me as I was listening. One was just this idea of revolution, but to think of it as a long process. You know, it has a long lead time, so a lot happens before it sort of starts. And then, because things are happening beforehand to create the conditions for it to happen, and then it seems to start. This looks like a revolution starting from above as a dispute within the bourgeoisie almost, that doesn't really involve people in it very much. And then at some point, as it gets going, the two sides have got to get the people on, they've got to involve the people, because they can't win without them. And at that point, they start to change. So the revolution starts to become more democratic, even if it starts out as a constitutional dispute in its first stage. And then it gets a momentum of its own. And what you've just described previously about Lincoln and how he had to draw the slaves in, he had to get black people into the army and so on, because they couldn't really win without it. They needed that to win. And you can see that same pattern in the English Revolution. And the thing you described is also at the beginning, in 1642, the Cavaliers were winning hands down. Their cavalry was absolutely slaughtering the parliamentary cavalry, because the parliamentary side, their cavalry, didn't know how to ride horses for a start off. And it was no contest. So the Cavalier side, the Royalist side, was winning easily. And the leaders on the parliamentary side didn't really want to win. They were kind of reluctant anyway. They didn't really want to overthrow the king, but they had to. And they were sort of stuck until the new model army was created, and then the whole game changed. because Cromwell then got ordinary people to teach them how to ride horses in a disciplined way, and they started beating the parliamentary cavalry. So that idea that one side, the northern side, starts without the means of winning, and the southern side's got all the officers and all the trained soldiers. That was what happened. That was what happened in England as well. Now, I just want to ask you this question, really, because when this revolution got going, is it really the completion? Is it really a second revolution, or is it really the completion of the first? And the reason I ask you that is because the thing that jumped out at me was it ended up with the 13th Amendment, you said. Now, that sounds like they didn't really overthrow the American Constitution and create another constitution. Actually, what they did was they modified the one they had already. So in a way, the first constitution survived this revolution, but was amended. And it's a little bit like our constitution, 300 years old, and it's been amended many times since, but it's still the old constitution, and it's still waiting to be changed in the modern era. So I'm wondering whether America could have an actual constitutional revolution, which goes back to your original point. Do these democratic revolutions, do we just have them at the beginning of capitalism, or can we have them in the middle, or can we have them towards the end, even though we don't know what the end is? Is America ripe for another constitution right now? Are the circumstances emerging in America whereby you've got to scrap that constitution and have a second or possibly the third American Revolution? I don't know. I do think it's still very relevant today.
Yeah, well, the answer to that question is yes. First of all, about the English Civil War, I wanted to point out that Cromwell at one point said that he'd like to fill his army with plain russet-coated Connecticut men. In other words, by the 1640s, the Puritans had settled in Boston in 1630. With the start of the English Civil War, many of them made their way back to England to take part in the war under Cromwell, and Cromwell especially valued the Connecticut men who had who he thought were very firm supporters of the Puritan cause. And the same Connecticut men, played a leading role in the Revolution of 1776, and then Boston, the biggest city in New England, a city founded by Puritans, became the center of abolitionism from the 1820s on. So there really is a straight line from the 1640s to the 1860s. And if you remember, Virginia was called by Charles II as Old Dominion because Virginia was Cavalier. And Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, essentially were all pro-Puritan. And these differences didn't fade over the years. In fact, if anything, they sharpened. So if you ever heard the song "The Battle Hymn of the Republic," composed by Julia Ward Howe, I mean, it's a classic Protestant Old Testament battle hymn, filled with all kinds of martial imagery that that could very well have been sung by Cromwell's troops. And as a question of the Constitution, you're of course absolutely correct. The reason is that that Reconstruction was abandoned and Black people sold out, and a kind of a neo-slavery reimposed that in certain respects was even worse than the old slavery. The reason all that was possible is that Northern industrialists moved very quickly to restrain any radical impulses that had been released by the war, and to reimpose the old Constitution with a few significant changes, but hardly revolutionary, and to restore the old status quo. So, in fact, in some ways, that the Southern elite actually gained more power, believe it or not. By the 1890s, remember the old 3/5 clause had given the South 25 extra seats in the House and 25 extra electoral votes. With the abolition of slavery, Blacks now counted as 5/5 of a person for purposes of congressional apportionment, even though by the 1870s they couldn't vote at all. So the Southern politicians actually gained an immense amount of clout by virtue of losing the Civil War. and the results were all the more oppressive and terrifying for the Black Southern population. And so, yes, the Southern status quo was the constitutional status quo was reimposed, and as for what's happening today, what we see is that same system by now 230 years old, just in a state of utter collapse, as Donald Trump, refuses to leave office amid vague rumors of some kind of coup being in the works. American democracy is the sick man of the West at this point. It is really just in a state of collapse. And so, yes, I think that America needs a new birth of liberty, to quote Lincoln. It needs a new democracy, and that democracy can only be led by the working class, by a socialist working class. So.
Okay, next question, Steve O'Neill.
Oh, hi, Dan. Thank you very much for speaking to us once again. Most of my questions have been preempted, I'm afraid, but I was just thinking about the Native Americans, which is part of my DNA as well. But except for the unfortunate incident in Minnesota, I'd always assumed that the Civil War presented a bit of a respite for them. Am I wrong with that?
I think you're basically correct, yes, but it was just the calm before the storm, because the post-Civil War period saw a dramatic escalation in Western movement, and therefore a dramatic increase in pressures on the Native American population.
Thank you.
Dan, it's a question from Marie Lynham. She really, I suppose, wants you to define the political parties. And she wants to know, for example, who the Republicans were, I suppose, politically and socially, but also were the Northerners Democrats? I think maybe Marie is thinking about contemporary politics and maybe talking more about the sort of origins of those parties. I know for many people in Europe, it's often very confusing about the nature of those parties.
Yeah, it is confusing. It's confusing to us as well. So the upside down quality of the American Revolution, as I said, it was a pre-modern revolution that in many ways reversed the polarities that were in effect in Europe. That upside down revolution gave rise to an upside down political system. I mean, Jefferson was the most radical exponent, most radical champion of the French Revolution. But Jefferson was first of all, he was a close friend of Lafayette, who deserted the French Revolution in 1791, went over to the opposing side. He was also a champion of slaveholders, of frontiersmen, who both elements, which in France were actually counter-revolutionary. Thinking of the country nobility, the peasantry who lived far from cities, etc. In France, the Jacobins drew their support from the urban classes, and especially the entrepreneurial business elements. The Jacobins were much more haute bourgeois than people realize. So in America, the pro-French politician was the slaveholder Jefferson, and the leading anti-French politician was Alexander Hamilton, who was from the North, was involved in financial activities, was an early industrializer. In other words, he was very close socially to the Jacobins, even though he was hostile politically, and Jefferson was very distant socially, yet much friendlier politically. After the Revolution, the Democrats became the party, which was founded by Jefferson. became the party of some northern artisans and laborers, but also the party of the southern slaveholders. And thus was born an intensely racist alliance between poor whites in the North and slaveholders in the South, which was opposed by Northern Whigs who drew very heavily from the business classes and at the same time from the free Black population. So the limousine liberals that we see in evidence in the United States, people who are wealthy and who berate, American workers for being racist, the pattern was set 230 years ago, 220 years ago by Jefferson and Hamilton. It's really quite remarkable. The Republican Party drew its strength from all those elements that had earlier supported the Jacobins. Tradesmen, educators, professionals, businessmen, commercial farmers, etc. So where the frontier farmers were engaged in subsistence agriculture, were far from the cities. Commercial farmers who lived, who farmed near northern cities, and catered to urban markets, were very much drawn into the Union military effort, just as the same elements had before the Jacobin Revolution. Yet another curious similarity between the Jacobins and the Republicans of the 1860s.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'm going to usurp my position as chair, and maybe to ask you, maybe as a sort of a summing up question, to talk really about Reconstruction and about its failure, in that if this was a second revolution, or a way of completing the first revolution, the sort of counter-revolution, as it were, against Reconstruction, I think needs to be explored a little more, particularly as in the last year or two, I've heard people talk about that failure and ascribe all sorts of reasons to it, from the nature of the American Constitution through to the nature of American capitalism. So I just wondered if you could maybe look at that. And I don't think we have any more questions, so I'll use.
I think Tony wants to ask another question.
Okay, well, if you answer mine, and then we'll take Tony then. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, the Reconstruction was a great tragedy. I mean, first of all, remember the French Revolution also ended in Thermidor and then in Bonaparte, and the undoing of a significant number of the great achievements of the French Revolution. If in a normal society, the North would have imposed a military government on the South. It would have established a militia composed of Blacks and pro-union whites to essentially suppress any counter-revolutionary disturbances. It would have moved to arm both people. They would have, they would have created, a good solid disciplined force. They would have moved to impose a federal justice system to ensure that the rights of everyone were respected, the rights of poor whites, the rights of Black people. And so a political basis would have been laid for a kind of a Black and white working class or popular movement aimed at democratizing the South and ensuring equal rights for all concerned. That didn't happen, not remotely. Under Andrew Johnson, the old institutions were left in effect. The power of the white landowning class was left intact. Blacks were not armed. Federal support, federal protection was spotty at best, and then was withdrawn increasingly. as the North sort of like, lost interest in the entire operation. Black people were subject to amazing levels of terrorism. There were, anti-Black pogroms. Blacks had gained significant political rights in the latter part of the 1860s, but they were reduced, gradually reduced. The Jim Crow system was introduced until by the 1880s and 90s, Blacks essentially were not able to vote at all. They were subject to the most whimsical violence by whites, and they could do nothing in return. And in the South, because America was democratic in some strange way, white solidarity against the enslaved Black population was democratized in a way. And what I mean by that is that every white person was encouraged to think that he had a stake in white solidarity against Blacks. And in fact, the way that poor whites could assert their equality with rich whites was by asserting all the more forcefully their role in that structure of white solidarity. So that's where we see this amazing phenomenon of American lynchings, rampant American violence, where economic tensions are released via persecutions of the Black population. This is not unprecedented. I mean, after serfs were freed in Russia, there was an incredible backsliding, and kind of a neo-serfdom was imposed. And of course, the czars used the Black Hundreds as outlets for, as in order to detour political tension, to sort of, shift it into anti-Semitic pogroms. So it was not unique, but it did reach a huge level and became the defining characteristic in the Southern way of life, and completely distorted American politics, and continues to do so until to this very day.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Tony, if you'd like to come in.
Yeah. It was just a very simple question. I remember reading or hearing about the Know Nothing Party, which was, I think, a third party in the US in, I think, the latter part of the 19th century. I just wondered what role it played and for how long and so on. Sorry about it's esoteric.
No, not at all. By the way, the Know Nothings were in the 1850s, and don't worry, Tony. If I ever try to talk about British politics, I'd make all kinds of mistakes myself. The Know Nothing parties were an anti-immigrant party in the 1850s. They had a very limited role. They did achieve a very widespread popularity for a brief period, but their significance lies in the breakup of the old Whig Democratic two-party system, and essentially that system burst into pieces. The Whigs disappeared, and they were replaced by the Republicans. And where the Whigs had tried to straddle the slavery question in the interest of national unity, the Republicans were sort of moved more and more forthrightly in an anti-slavery direction.
Thanks.
Okay, Dan. Well, you've worked very hard, as you always do on these talks. You respond to all the questions directly. Some of us like to take a bit of a rest. Some of us like to take a bit of a rest as we're doing it, but you go in and bat straight away. I'd like to thank you. I don't know if you have any final concluding words, because you have worked very hard.
Well, yeah, just very briefly. I mean, it was one of the really defining episodes in the creation of the modern democratic world. It saw immense breakthroughs, the overthrow of slavery. I think it was a mass expropriation of the entire Southern ruling class. Something like $2 million worth of property was essentially seized and liquidated in one of the greatest mass expropriations of modern history. So it was really a revolutionary event. But the America that eventually emerged out of it was even more conservative, more bourgeois, more anti-working class than it was before. So history treads a very crooked path.
Okay, thank you very much, and for a very informative, stimulating talk. I'm sure we'll ask you back again next year, Dan. There's plenty to talk, particularly about the nature of American society in the 20th century, and particularly the history of the British labor movement. The American labor movement, which isn't always, I think, as well known in Britain as it should be. So that ends tonight's talk, comrades. Next week's talk will be on the first international and one of the world's first organized working class parties. And we will then be following on in the weeks ahead with the Paris Commune and then the second international. And I think we will be then coming to the end of our series just before Christmas. So I'd like to thank Dan again very much for his talk. Thank everybody for making a contribution. And I look forward to seeing you again. So good night and thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.